Geoverse Part 2 To Love is Human by GeodesicDragon Chapter 11 Where I Belong Part 2. I was standing in the very clearing where I first met Twilight and the others. A single tear rolled down my cheek as I took in my surroundings, a ridiculously wide grin on my face. John took a walk around and came across something in the grass. He looked at it and his eyes widened. "Hey, Geo!" he called. "Check this out!" I went over to him and he pointed at the ground. The remains of a fire smoldered in a pit dug into the ground. I said. Someone was camping here. I surveyed the ground surrounding the fire pit. I could see grass which was slightly singed, leftover wood, and streamers. I smiled. "She was waiting for me," I said. "Who?" John asked, looking up from the fire pit. "Twilight?" I nodded and John chuckled. "Well then, if she's not here, she'll be in town," he said. He returned to face Dr. Sorrow, who was standing in the middle of the clearing, taking in the beauty of his new surroundings. I went over to him. "Hey, Doc," I said. "Such a wonderful place," he said. "I'm so pleased I'll be able to study it properly, rather than using my birds." "You mean birds?" I said mockingly. "Let's not start that again," Sorrow said flatly. He turned to face me. "Now I assume you are eager to get into town?" I nodded so fast I thought my head was going to fall off. "Very well," Sorrow replied, patting his robot. "Get on, and Tiny shall take us where we need to go." I climbed onto Tiny's treads and sat down. John followed suit, taking a position across from mine. Sorrow went into his pockets and pulled out a cassette tape. He tossed it from hand to hand as he spoke to us. "Would you care for a little music as we ride?" he asked. "Sure, no problem," I replied. "Anything to avoid talking to you two," I grinned. Sorrow smiled and climbed on board Tiny. He pressed a button and a set of speakers rose out of each of the bot's shoulders. With a chuckle he put the tape in the player before looking at me. "Let's go," he said. "Just point the way into town and Tiny will do the rest." "That way," I said, pointing down a dirt track. At those words, Tiny set off down the tracks, gears grinding and treads rumbling. Nobody spoke, but the huge grin on my face and the tears streaming from my eyes were all the expression I needed. The atmosphere in Sugarcube Corner was as thick as treacle. Twilight and her friends stared in disbelief at Princess Celestia. "Discord?" Rainbow Dash asked, still shocked. "Are you sure?" "Discord's statue is still in the palace gardens," Celestia replied. "So he hasn't been released. This could be the work of one of his followers trying to free him." Rainbow Dash puffed out her chest. "Well, let's go find them and kick their flanks," she said fiercely. The others voiced their approval at Rainbow Dash's plan. Celestia smiled. "I'm glad you think that way," she said, levitating a small box in front of her. "The elements of harmony are in here. Put them on and we'll go." She opened the box and each pony took their respective element. "Let's get going, girls," Celestia said. "Every moment we wait, there is a chance Discord will be back." Throwing some bits on the table, Twilight and the others hurriedly followed Celestia out of the shop and into the town square. The townsponies gasped and bowed on seeing Princess Celestia. She smiled at them before leading the way out of town along the path past Fluttershy's house and into the Everfree forest. "Be on your guard, every pony," she said quietly. "I don't know what lurks out here." Silence fell as the group trudged along the road. As Tiny rolled along the dirt track, I could see the familiar skyline of Ponyville in the distance. I tapped Sorrow on the shoulder. "We'll be in Ponyville in 10 minutes, I said to him. "You and John had better get ready to introduce yourselves." I looked down at my ride. "And, Doc, you'd better be prepared to answer a lot of questions." He chuckled. "Yes," he said, "and most of them will probably be about Tiny." Tiny let out a small beep. "Don't worry, Tiny," Sorrow said, patting him. "Daddy will make sure nobody says anything mean about you. Yes, he will. Yes, he will." I exhaled sharply and turned to face John. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked. "You have a life back on Earth. Why share mine?" John snorted. "A life?" he said glumly. "That wasn't a life, what I had. The only real friend I had was you, and I couldn't hold a job." I looked at him sympathetically. "You said so many great things about this place," John continued. "I felt that it would be the ideal location to start my new life." I nodded. "It's a great place," I said. "The ponies are great, and they'll accept you with open hoofs." John smiled. "Although I'm not quite sure how they'll react to him," I said, pointing at Sorrow. "Hey, Doc." Sorrow turned to face me. "We'll be there in 5 minutes, and you haven't even played that cassette yet," I said with a quizzical expression on my face. Sorrow laughed. "I guess now would be a good time," he said. He reached over to the cassette player and pressed a button. As the music blared out of the speakers on Tiny's shoulders, I laughed out loud. "There's no way Twilight will miss this entrance," I thought. The 7 ponies trotted silently along the twisting path, their eyes constantly checking their surroundings. "I don't like this," Celestia whispered. "Me neither," replied Twilight. "It's too quiet." "Do you reckon they know we're comin'?" Applejack asked. "It's a possibility," Celestia replied. "Stay alert, every pony." They continued walking, their hearts beating in their throats and their ears tuned for the smallest of noises. Suddenly Celestia stopped walking and stood still. She looked around for a moment before a puzzled look appeared on her face. "Listen," she said quietly. "Can any pony hear that?" The others strained their ears. They listened intently as a sound rather like music filled their senses, rapidly getting louder. "What in tarnation is that racket?" Applejack said. The 7 of them stood, rooted to the spot. The music was soon accompanied by a deep rumbling, causing leaves to fall from the trees and animals to hide. "Whatever it is," Twilight said, "it's coming right for us." "Then we shall stand our ground here," Celestia replied, narrowing her eyes towards the noise. "Get ready, girls." They took up defensive stances and waited. As the noise got closer, the 7 ponies heard singing along with the music. They scrunched their faces up in confusion. "'Cause I'm back, yes I'm back, well I'm back, yes I'm back, well I'm back, back, well I'm back in black, yes I'm back in black." Rarity covered her ears. "Make it stop!" she squealed. "Stay strong, girls!" Celestia yelled above the noise. Her staunch demeanor soon faded when she saw what was approaching, replaced with a look of panic. It was a metal behemoth which rolled along the ground. It was much taller than even Celestia was, and was covered with various bits of machinery. Celestia looked closer. Sitting on the machine were 2 figures, doing gestures imitating playing a guitar and flailing their heads back and forth. She gasped. "Humans!" she shouted. The 2 figures on the metal beast looked up at her, their mouths agape. A series of grinding noises followed as the tracked monster ground to a shuddering halt, just feet away from the 7 ponies. The music and noise stopped abruptly as the 2 figures on board jumped off. "This is incredible," one of them said. He was wearing a pair of goggles and a white coat. "Holy crap," the other one replied. This is just—" He couldn't finish his sentence. Celestia's eyes narrowed again. "Identify yourselves!" she yelled. "Who are you, and why have you come to Equestria?" The human wearing the white coat put his arms out in front of him. "Please," he said, "we mean you no harm." "The last time I heard those words from your kind, human," Celestia spat, "I was nearly killed." Twilight stepped forward and pointed at the hunk of metal the 2 had been sitting on. "What is this thing?" she demanded. "It looks dangerous." The white-coated human looked at the machine. "What? Tiny?" he said with a shocked gasp. "He wouldn't hurt a fly." "You actually gave that thing a name?" Rainbow Dash said with disdain, giving the human a fierce glare. The other human stepped forward. "Please," he said, "you misunderstand our intentions. We are not here to cause trouble." Celestia gave a bitter laugh. The human sighed. "Look, at least let us explain ourselves," he said. "My name is John Adams, and this is Dr. Ace Sorrow. We've spent a long time trying to find a way here." "Why?" demanded Twilight. "What possible reason could you have for coming to our world?" "You," another voice said. "You're the reason." Twilight's face fell upon hearing the voice. "What trickery is this?" she shouted. "Show yourself!" Another human stepped out from behind the machine. "With pleasure," he said. Twilight's expression went from one of anger to one of joy. The third human smiled at her. "Hello, Twilight," he said. "I'm home." A burst of purple filled my vision as Twilight leapt on me. She prodded me sharply in the chest as if to check that I was real. Her smile widened even further when I grunted. It's really you," she squealed. "I knew you'd come back. I just knew it." Before I could reply, she was kissing me. I returned the favor eagerly as we both released weeks of pent-up longing. Eventually, I tore myself away from Twilight and stood up. "I told you that I would do anything to see her smile, come hell or high water," I said to Celestia, "and I intend to keep that promise." Celestia smiled. Another burst of color filled my vision as the other 5 enveloped me in a group hug. "I knew you'd come back," Pinkie Pie said excitedly. "Now I can throw a huge, super-duper, wonderfully magnificent, splendorific party for you and Twilight." Rainbow Dash punched me on the shoulder. "Welcome back, Gale," she said with a smile. "Do you all have any idea how much work you've missed?" Applejack said with a fierce look. I looked at her and she fell over laughing. "I'm only teasing, Sugar Cube," she said. "Welcome home." "It's nice to see you again," Fluttershy said. "Yes, darling," Rarity said. "We are all so glad you're back where you belong at last." I was about to reply when a cough distracted me. "Now that you've got your welcomes, can you help us out here?" John asked, giving me a deadpan stare. I laughed weakly. "Yeah, sorry," I said. I turned to Celestia. "This is John, a friend I made after I arrived back in my world." "Just like you promised," Twilight said, nuzzling my neck. I stroked her mane as I smiled. "And this is Dr. Ace Sorrow," I indicated the eccentric doctor, who smiled and waved. It was his machine that brought me back here, so I consider him a friend too. Without his help, I don't know what I would have done to get back here. Celestia trotted over to Sorrow. She looked at Tiny, who was brimming with scientific instruments. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, smiling. "As friends of Gale's, you and John are welcome to stay here, and I offer my apologies for my earlier behavior." "That's okay," Sorrow said, patting Tiny. "I can assure you that I just want to study this world." Celestia smiled. "Then study away," she said. "I see that, Tiny is loaded with construction materials. I assume you would like to build a laboratory somewhere?" Sorrow nodded. "With your permission, of course," he said, offering a bow. "I'm sure we can find somewhere for you," Celestia replied as she turned to face me. "Come, let us return to Ponyville. I am keen to hear the story of how you found your way back to us." I chuckled. "Well, I hope you've got a spare few hours," I said. The 10 of us, followed by Tiny, set out along the path to Ponyville, Twilight walking at my side. As we walked, I sighed contentedly. "What's wrong?" asked Twilight, concern in her voice. I picked her up and kissed her deeply. "Nothing," I said. "Not a single goddamn thing." I hoisted her onto my shoulders as Ponyville came into view. Tears ran down my cheeks as I beamed from ear to ear. I was home. Author's note. Just the epilogue now. I hope you've enjoyed reading this story.